The year is 690. An old woman stands before the dragon throne of China and sits down on it. She is 65 years old. She has survived 2 emperors, outlasted 1,000 men who were certain she would fail, and spent 4 decades learning exactly how the most dangerous court in the world worked. Her name is Wu Zetian, and what she does on this day has not happened in the long history of imperial China. It has not happened again. She does not take the throne as a widow holding it for a son. She does not take it as a regent keeping it warm for the next man in line. She takes it as emperor, in her own name, by her own determination. Settle in. Let the noise of the day fall away. Tonight we travel to the Tang Dynasty, to the life of a woman who began as a minor concubine in a palace of thousands and ended as the ruler of one of the largest empires on earth. This is not a simple story about ambition. It is not a simple story about cruelty. It is a story about what it costs to do something the world insists cannot be done. Wherever you are, whatever hour this finds you, come with me. We begin at the beginning. Chapter 1. The Girl the Emperor Noticed. She was born in the year 624, in the city of Lizhou, in what is now the Sichuan province of southwestern China. The house she grew up in sat in a landscape of river mist and green hills, the kind of terrain that rewards attentiveness, where the weather shifts without announcement, and the person who learns to read the small signs before the large changes arrive develops an instinct that stays with them for life. Whether Wu was born with that instinct, or whether the landscape sharpened something already, there is not something any source can tell us. What the sources do establish, consistently and across accounts from different political perspectives, is that she was unusual from the beginning, and that the people around her recognized it. Her father was Wu Shihuo, a man who had made his reputation and his fortune in the timber trade before the wars of unification gave him something more valuable than wood. He had backed the right warlord at the right moment, a general named Li Yuan, who was in the process of dismantling the collapsing Sui dynasty and building something new from its pieces. Li Yuan became the founding emperor of the Tang Dynasty, the man history would call Gaozu, and Wu Shihuo became, by the logic of loyalty, rewarded, a man of rank and favour at the new court. He was not born into the aristocracy. He had arrived there through timing and judgment, which meant he understood something about the world that men born into power sometimes never fully learn. Position is not permanent. It is constructed, and it can be taken away. His daughter was watching all of this before she was old enough to name what she was watching. Her mother came from a different world entirely. Lady Yang was a member of the old Sui imperial family, a woman of genuine classical education in an era when women of her class were expected to manage households and produce heirs and not much beyond it. She taught her daughter to read. She taught her to play the zither. She introduced her to poetry and to the historical chronicles that formed the intellectual backbone of Chinese culture. This was not typical. Girls in 7th century Tang China, even girls from wealthy families, were generally prepared for marriage and domestic life. Wu received something closer to the education that would have been designed for a promising son. Her father died when she was around 12 years old. The loss was not simply personal, it was structural. A Tang household's position in the world depended significantly on the living man at its head, and Wu Shihuo's death exposed his family to the social pressures that always circled families whose protection had suddenly been reduced. The established Wu clan relatives, who had never fully embraced Lady Yang's branch of the family, became more difficult. The respectful distance that rank had maintained collapsed into something closer to condescension. Wu noticed. Wu remembered. She had always noticed, and she had always remembered, in the year 637. When Wu was around 13 years old, a summons arrived from the imperial court at Chang'an. Emperor Taizong, the second Tang emperor and one of the most celebrated rulers in Chinese history, was expanding his palace household. Talent scouts, as later historians have described the process, had been sent throughout the empire to identify young women of suitable appearance and bearing. The selection reached into households at Wu's level of society. Lady Yang received the news with whatever combination of pride and grief a mother feels when her daughter is called to a world that cannot be refused. The two of them stood together before Wu departed. Lady Yang wept. Her daughter, by one account preserved in later sources, did not. This detail has been repeated in accounts of Wu Zetian for 14 centuries because it rings true to everything that followed. Not because she was cold, but because she appears to have understood, even at 13, that weeping would change nothing about what was coming. She was going to Chang'an. She was going to the palace of the most powerful man in the world. What she could control was not the fact of going, but how she arrived and what she did when she got there. The journey from Lizhou to Chang'an would have taken weeks. Travelling by road and river through landscapes of increasing scale, as the provincial world gave way to the approaches of the capital. Chang'an, in the early Tang period, was one of the great cities of the world. Its population has been estimated by historians at perhaps 1 million people, a number that placed it among the most populous cities on earth at that time. The streets were organized on a grid of mathematical precision. Markets overflowed with goods from Central Asia, India, Persia, and beyond. Buddhist temples and Taoist shrines competed for the attention of a population that was, by the standards of its era, cosmopolitan in ways that most of the world was not. At the center of all of it stood the imperial palace city of Chang'an, the layered world of administration and imperial life. Enclosed by walls and organized by protocols so elaborate that understanding them fully was itself a form of education that took years. Wu arrived at the palace and was assigned a rank. The Tang imperial household was not a simple arrangement of women waiting for imperial attention. It was a bureaucracy, a structured system with clearly defined levels, each carrying different titles, different privileges, different degrees of access to the emperor and to the life of the court. At the highest levels were the imperial consorts, women of considerable formal standing. Below them, descending through numerous grades, came hundreds of women in positions of decreasing status and influence. At the lower levels were palace ladies who might serve for years without ever having meaningful proximity to the emperor. Wu was assigned the rank of Karen, which translates roughly as talented lady. It was not the lowest rank in the system, but it was far from the highest. Historical accounts of the period suggest somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 women lived within the palace at any given time during Taizong's reign. Wu was one among thousands, a new arrival from a provincial family. Without the deep aristocratic connections that would have given her a natural starting advantage, she was 14 years old. She was entering a world where the rules were elaborate. The stakes were total, and almost every woman around her was trying to solve the same problem she was. How do you distinguish yourself in a system designed to keep you interchangeable? The answer most Karen defaulted to was the obvious one. Attract the emperor's personal attention through beauty and charm, which was the path to higher rank and greater security. This worked for some women. It was unreliable because the emperor's attention was finite and the competition was unlimited. What the evidence of Wu's later career suggests is that she understood, even in those early years, that there was a longer game available to those patient enough to play it. She learned the structure of the palace with the thoroughness of someone who grasped that knowledge of how a system worked was more durable than any favour the system's ruler might grant and later withdraw. She paid attention to who held influence not through rank but through information. Which servants knew which secrets, which officials depended on which relationships, how the flow of access and favour actually moved through the corridors of power rather than how the formal protocols said it moved. She also came to the attention of Emperor Taizong, not through a single dramatic encounter. What the records suggest is that Taizong recognized in this particular Karen something different from the general population of the palace. She was assigned duties that brought her into closer proximity with the emperor's daily life. She served in capacities that required literacy and discretion. In a court where most women were valued primarily for their physical presence, Wu was being noticed for something else. Taizong gave her a name. He called her Mei Niang, which means something close to charming lady. It was a name he gave her, not one she was born with. And the distinction between a name that is given and a name that is earned would take years to fully reveal itself. There is one story from these years that every account of Wu Zetian returns to. Historians treat it as illustrative of her character, rather than verified in every detail. The story concerns a horse. Emperor Taizong kept a famous horse, a large and difficult animal known as lion mane that no groom had been fully able to manage. One day, in a gathering that included Wu among other palace attendants, Taizong expressed his frustration. Wu spoke. She said she could break the horse. She would need 3 things: an iron whip, an iron hammer, and an iron spike. She would whip it into obedience. If the whip did not work, she would hammer it into submission. If the hammer did not work, she would drive the spike through its throat. The room went still. You do not, in the Tang imperial court, casually propose killing the emperor's favourite horse. You do not, as a Karen of modest rank, speak with that directness in the presence of the emperor. Whether the story happened exactly as told cannot be confirmed. What it preserves is a quality that the full record of Wu's life documents consistently, the willingness to say clearly and without softening exactly what she thought, even in rooms where silence was the safer choice. She was not performing submission. She was not performing charm. She was expressing, with complete clarity, how she approached difficult problems. She spent approximately a decade at the palace of Emperor Taizong. By the conventional measures of palace advancement, the decade was not a success. She did not rise significantly in rank. She did not produce children for the emperor. She did not accumulate the visible markers of imperial favour that signalled rising importance. A Karen at 24 was, in most cases, a Karen who had not found her way to something better. But she had spent 10 years at the centre of Tang imperial power during one of its most consequential reigns. She had watched Taizong manage a court full of brilliant, competitive men. She had observed how policy was made and challenged and remade, how military campaigns were planned and evaluated, how the relationship between the emperor and his officials actually functioned beneath the formal language of edicts and ceremonies. The learning she accumulated in those years was not from books. It was from sustained, careful observation of power exercised at the highest level. She had also been watching, with particular attention, a young man who was not yet emperor. His name was Li Ji. He was Taizong's 9th son, named Crown Prince, in the year 643, after the original Crown Prince was removed for conspiring against his father. Li Ji was not an obvious heir. He was gentle where his father was forceful, visibly uncertain where Taizong projected absolute confidence. The court looked at him and saw a man who would be manageable, which was exactly what certain factions wanted in their next emperor. What the evidence of what followed suggests is that Wu saw something different, a man who needed steadiness, a man whose openness to guidance made him, in certain ways, more approachable than a man of absolute self-certainty would have been, a man who might, when the time came to be emperor, remember who had seen him clearly when everyone else was measuring him against his father and finding him wanting. What passed between them during Taizong's reign cannot be recovered with certainty from the surviving sources. Later accounts range from romantic elaboration to deliberate silence, each shaped by the political purposes of the people who wrote them. What is established without serious dispute is that a connection existed, and what it meant depended entirely on what came next. In the spring of 649, Emperor Taizong fell seriously ill. He was 50 years old. He had spent his adult life fighting, and the accumulated demands of decades of campaigns and court struggles had taken their toll in ways that no physician of the period could fully address. He died in the summer of 649. With him died the world Wu Zetian had spent 10 years learning. When an emperor died, the women of his palace household who had not borne him children did not simply continue their lives. They were removed from the palace. The destination was a Buddhist monastery, where they would live out their remaining years as nuns, their heads shaved, their previous lives officially over. Wu Zetian was 24 years old. She gathered what she was permitted to take, and walked out of the palace that had been her world for a decade. She walked into Ganye Temple. The doors closed behind her, and what happened next is where the real story begins. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Waited. The monastery of Ganye Temple sat on the outskirts of Chang'an, close enough to the capital that the sounds of the city carried through the walls on quiet mornings, far enough that the world inside those walls operated by entirely different rules. It was not formally a punishment. No edict called it a prison. The women who arrived there after Taizong's death were not criminals. They were women whose specific position had ended with the man who had defined it, and the Tang state had arranged a dignified container for them, a place where they could live out their years in religious observance, removed from the world of courts and succession and the politics of imperial memory. The robes were grey. The food was simple. The days were structured around prayers and agricultural work and the particular silence that monasteries cultivate deliberately. The absence of the kind of conversation that might lead somewhere interesting or somewhere dangerous. The stone floors were cold in winter. The cells were small. The sound of the prayer bells marked the hours with a regularity that could be either comforting or maddening, depending on the person listening to them. Wu was 24 years old, in full health, with a mind that had spent a decade absorbing everything the most sophisticated court in the world had to offer. She was now expected to apply that mind to prayer schedules and vegetable gardens for the next 50 years. The other women there had arrived at different points and from different positions, some from higher ranks than Wu had held, some from lower ones. What they shared was the condition of having been removed from the only world most of them had known since adolescence. Some of them adapted to the monastery, some of them did not, and the ones who did not express their inability in ways that the closed world of a monastery contains but cannot resolve. What the evidence of Wu's subsequent life suggests is that she did not collapse inward during those 2 years. She continued to read whatever texts the monastery made available. She observed the rhythms of the institution around her with the same attention she had brought to the rhythms of the palace. The lesson available in Ganye Temple, for a person capable of learning it, was the lesson of how to maintain the interior life when the exterior world has been reduced to grey robes and vegetable gardens and the sound of bells at hours you did not choose. It is not a small lesson. Most people never need to learn it, because most people are never required to. Wu was required to, and the evidence of everything that came after suggests she learned it completely. She had known Li Ji before Taizong died. The precise nature of what had existed between them in Taizong's court cannot be recovered from the surviving sources with confidence, and the accounts that describe it most dramatically are the accounts most shaped by political purposes that arrived later. What is established without serious dispute is this. After Li Ji became Emperor Gaozong in 649, he came to Gange Temple. He came more than once. The official reason was filial. A new emperor was expected to honour his father's memory through ritual observances at the institutions connected to his father's life. A monastery housing his late father's former palace ladies was a legitimate destination for that kind of visit. No one who understood Tang court protocol would have found reason to question it. But he asked to see Wu specifically. The meeting that followed is one of those historical moments where the surviving accounts are clear about what happened and almost entirely silent about the texture of it. He saw her. She wept. Or the sources record that she appeared to weep. He was moved. What they said to each other, if any accurate record of it ever existed, is gone. What is not gone is the consequence. Gaozong decided that Wu Zetian was coming back to the palace. This was not a simple decision. The women of a deceased emperor's household carried significant social and moral weight in the Confucian framework of Tang society. Bringing one of them into an active relationship with his successor violated conventions that serious officials took seriously. And some of them said so. In the careful language that advisors use when they believe their emperor is making a mistake, but understand the cost of saying so too directly, Gaozong did it anyway. In 650, Wu Zetian left Ganye Temple. The grey robes came off. Her hair, which had been cut when she entered, was growing back. She returned to Chang'an, to the imperial palace city, to the world she had studied for 10 years and been expelled from. She returned not as she had left. She returned as a woman who had something no one else in the palace had: the specific and personal attention of the emperor, and she returned with 2 years of enforced stillness behind her that had, if anything, sharpened her sense of what the next steps required. The imperial palace city of Chang'an that Wu returned to in the early years of Gaozong's reign is worth pausing to understand, because most of what happened over the next decade cannot be fully followed without it. The palace city was not one building, but a city within a city, spreading across hundreds of acres and organized around the layered functions of imperial life. Administrative offices, where officials drafted edicts and processed the paperwork of empire. Audience halls, where the emperor received ministers. Inner courtyards, where the imperial family lived, separated from the administrative world by walls and protocols that were as much cultural as physical. Gardens designed with mathematical care. Throughout all of it, a population of tens of thousands. Servants and officials and guards and scholars and physicians and craftsmen, each embedded in a hierarchy so detailed that your position within it determined everything from where you slept to who could speak to you and in what tone. The women's quarters, the inner palace, were both separated from and deeply connected to this administrative world, separated in the physical sense, connected in consequence, because the succession, the alliances between great families, and the distribution of imperial favour that shaped careers across the entire empire all flowed through what happened in those inner rooms. The empress at the time of Wu's return was a woman known to history as Empress Wang. She came from a powerful aristocratic family and had been carefully selected as Gaozong's empress before his accession. A strategic marriage that bound important clans to the new emperor. She was intelligent, educated, and entirely aware that the emperor's personal attention had been diminishing and would not improve after Wu's return. The marriage was functional but not warm. Empress Wang had not produced a male heir, which in the political logic of the Tang court was a vulnerability that the people around her understood, and some were already calculating around. There was also a woman known as Consort Xiao, a favoured concubine who had borne Gaozong children and who occupied a position of considerable influence. She and Empress Wang had developed, in the years before Wu's return, the specific wariness of two women who understood they were competing for finite imperial attention in a system where that competition had real and lasting consequences. Into this arrangement walked Wu Zetian. What the evidence of what followed suggests is that she assessed the situation with the attention of someone who had spent 10 years studying this exact environment and 2 years in enforced stillness, thinking about it. Empress Wang's strength rested on family connections that were external to the palace rather than on the interior relationships that actually shaped daily court life. Consort Xiao's position depended entirely on the emperor's continued personal interest. Both women had vulnerabilities. Both would eventually make the mistake of underestimating the woman who had returned from a monastery with nothing but her mind and her understanding of how power moved through institutions. Wu bore Gaozong a son in 652, then another son, then a daughter. The production of male heirs was the most concrete form of security available to a woman in her position. But children alone did not explain what happened next. What happened next requires understanding something about Gaozong that the court around him never fully reckoned with. He was not the weak, manageable emperor his ministers had anticipated. He was a man whose gentleness was genuine, but whose capacity for decisive action, when his personal loyalty was engaged, was also genuine. He was deeply attached to Wu Zetian in the way that people become attached to someone who understands how they think and values what they find there. She was useful to him in ways that went far beyond the personal, and he knew it. The alliance between them was the most important political fact of the Tang court in the early 650s. Almost everyone in that court spent those years trying to work around it rather than understanding what it actually was. By 654, Wu had been back in the palace for 4 years. She had rank, children, and the emperor's trust. She had an understanding of the court's internal landscape that her rivals could not match. She was 30 years old. The next move was forming. Everyone in the court could sense it. Almost no one was right about what it would be. Chapter 3. The Accusation that Changed Everything. In the autumn of 654, a baby girl died in the inner palace. She was Wu Zetian's daughter, an infant of less than 2 months. The death of a very young child in 7th century China was not, by the terrible arithmetic of that era, unusual. Infant mortality was high across every level of society, and the palace, despite its resources, was not protected from the illnesses that took small lives with cruel regularity. What made this death different was not the death itself. It was what Wu said immediately afterward. Empress Wang had visited the baby that day. This is recorded in multiple sources and is not seriously disputed by historians. After she left, Wu found the infant dead. When Gaozong came to the inner palace and asked what had happened, Wu said that Empress Wang had killed the child. The accusation fell into the court like a stone into still water, and the rings it made spread outward for years. This is the moment in Wu Zetian's story where the honest narrator must stop and be precise about what the evidence actually shows and what it does not, because the temptation in either direction, either to accept the accusation as proof of Wu's ruthlessness or to dismiss it as pure invention by her enemies, is a temptation that the historical record does not support. The investigation that followed, as Tang court protocol required, produced no conclusive evidence against Empress Wang. The sources that document this, including sources that are not sympathetic to Wu, are consistent on this point. There were no witnesses. There was no physical evidence pointing specifically at anyone. The investigators concluded what honest investigators in such cases are forced to conclude when the facts are irrecoverable. Nothing certain could be established. The range of serious historical interpretations of this event is genuinely wide and has not narrowed across centuries of scholarship. Some scholars, working from sources that represent the perspective of the aristocratic families Wu later displaced, argue that she killed her own infant or allowed her to die in order to frame Empress Wang, making one of the coldest calculations in the history of political ambition. These sources have shaped how the story has been told for a very long time, and their influence on the popular understanding of Wu Zetian is enormous. Other scholars point out that these same sources were written or heavily edited by people who had profound political reasons to construct the most damaging possible account of Wu's character, and that attributing the worst interpretation to an unverified accusation is itself a form of historical bias rather than historical judgment. They note that Empress Wang was operating in a deteriorating political position and had real motives of her own, though motive alone is not evidence. Still other scholars argue that the honest position is to acknowledge that the truth of what happened in that room is simply not recoverable, that the sources cannot tell us, and that presenting any single interpretation as established fact misrepresents what the evidence actually shows. What history can state with confidence is this: the death happened, the accusation was made, the investigation was inconclusive, and the consequences that followed were real regardless of where the truth lay. The accusation accelerated a process that had been building for months. Gaozong was moving toward a decision that a significant portion of his court considered dangerous. He wanted to make Wu Zetian his empress. The opposition was serious, and came from men of genuine principle, as well as from men defending their own interests. And the honest account requires acknowledging both. The great aristocratic families of the Tang court understood what elevating Wu would mean. She was not from their world. Her father had made his position rather than inherited it. Making her empress would signal that the emperor was prepared to break the social compact that the aristocracy depended on. The minister, Chu Suiliang, one of the most respected officials of the period, and a man whose moral seriousness the sources document from multiple perspectives, made the case against it directly to Gaozong. He argued that Empress Wang had committed no proven offence that justified removal. He argued that the stability of the dynasty depended on respecting the social foundations that had produced it. He was making the strongest sincere case available to him, and he was making it with genuine conviction. Gaozong dismissed him. He dismissed the others who made similar arguments. The dismissals were not simple arrogance. Gaozong appears to have genuinely weighed the opposition and decided that what he was doing was right, which is not the same as deciding it was without cost. In 655, Empress Wang and Consort Xiao were formally charged. The specific charges included accusations of using supernatural means against the emperor. Historians examining these charges have generally noted that the evidence behind them was thin, and that the charges functioned as a mechanism for a political outcome that had already been decided, rather than as findings of a genuinely impartial process. Empress Wang and Consort Xiao were stripped of their ranks and imprisoned. Within weeks they were dead. The manner of their deaths, described in multiple sources with a specificity that reads as deliberately recorded, was extreme. Whether Wu Zetian ordered this directly, authorized it, or had it carried out by officials acting in her interest without explicit instruction, is a question the surviving sources do not resolve cleanly. The outcome is documented. The chain of decision is not. Wu Zetian was declared Empress of the Tang Dynasty in the 11th month of 655. She was 30 years old. The announcement moved through the court with the particular quality that certain announcements have. The quality of confirming what everyone had known was coming, while still landing with the force of something genuinely new. The aristocratic families who had opposed the elevation absorbed the news with whatever combination of calculation and genuine alarm their situations produced. The officials who had argued most loudly against it faced the specific situation of men who have staked their credibility on preventing something that has now happened anyway. And in the rooms that had been Empress Wang's and were now hers, a woman who had walked into a monastery as the discarded property of a dead emperor stood in the ceremonial robes of the highest-ranking woman in the Tang Empire and understood, with the clarity that had organized everything she had ever done, that reaching this moment was not the achievement. The achievement was what came next. Chapter 4. The Weight of two thrones. Gaozong's headaches began in the early 660s. They were not ordinary headaches. They were something deeper and more disabling. A pressure behind his eyes that left him temporarily unable to read documents, unable to sustain the long audiences that Tang governance required, unable to perform the continuous administrative work that the empire demanded of its emperor every single day. His physicians tried what 7th century Chinese medicine made available. Some treatments helped briefly. None of them addressed whatever was happening underneath. Modern historians, reviewing the symptoms as described in Tang sources, have suggested various possibilities. Hypertension, a series of small vascular events, a chronic neurological condition. The specific medical reality is irrecoverable from this distance. What the record shows clearly is that by the early 660s, Gaozong was intermittently incapable of performing the full duties of his office. Wu stepped in, not dramatically, not through a formal declaration of expanded authority, through the simple and practical reality that the empire required someone to do the work that Gaozong could not do on the days he could not do it. And Wu was there and capable, and had been learning this work for the better part of 20 years. She processed documents. She consulted officials. She reviewed the military reports and administrative accounts and the continuous flow of information that moved through the imperial center every day. She did this with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the legitimacy of what she was doing depended entirely on the quality of what she produced. Not adequate, genuinely good, not once but consistently. Gaozong knew. The arrangement was not deception. When he had good periods, he reasserted his direct involvement. When he had bad periods, he relied on her. This is documented across different sources with enough consistency to reflect how the partnership actually worked, rather than how it was described after the fact. In 660, Gaozong raised with his senior ministers the question of formalizing Wu's role in reviewing and deciding on state matters. The proposal landed heavily. The minister, Hao Chujun, argued with the careful language of a man who knows he is disagreeing with his emperor that the arrangement proposed would set a dangerous precedent. He invoked historical examples. He framed his objection in the strongest terms available to him within the protocols that governed how an official could address the throne. Gaozong appeared to back down. The ministers left the audience, believing they had prevented something. They had not prevented it. They had delayed it by a few months. What followed demonstrated something about how Wu approached obstacles that a direct confrontation in an audience never could. She did not attempt to win the formal debate. She continued doing the work. Every document processed correctly. Every decision that produced a good outcome. Every administrative problem handled with efficiency. The result, NC, were the argument. They were made not in words, but in the daily reality of an empire that was functioning. And it is very difficult to argue against something that is working. By 661, the formal authorization the ministers had opposed had been granted in practice, even if the ceremony around it remained ambiguous. Documents came to Wu. Decisions went out, carrying the weight of imperial authority. The court had been presented with a situation in which opposing the arrangement meant opposing the functioning of the empire itself. And most officials understood that this was a position they could not sustain indefinitely. The Tang court began calling them the Two Sages, Sheng in Chinese, two sources of legitimate imperial authority, a recognition that the governance of the Tang had become a shared enterprise. The title was respectful. It was also, from the perspective of the officials who had spent years trying to prevent exactly this outcome, a defeat that had been given a permanent name. Wu was now, in functional terms, co-ruler of the Tang Dynasty. She was 37 years old. A man named Direnji was, in this period, building the career that would eventually make him one of the most celebrated officials in the history of Chinese governance. He was serving in provincial positions in the 660s, accumulating a reputation for principled judgment and incorruptible administration that would eventually bring him to the centre of court life. Wu had not yet worked with him directly, but the examination pathways through which men like Direnji advanced were ones she had been quietly shaping, and the officials coming through those pathways were beginning to populate the layers of Tang administration in ways whose full consequences would only become visible over years. She was thinking in years. The evidence of everything she did suggests she had always thought in years. The military situation of this period placed additional demands on governance that Wu engaged with directly. Tang forces were operating on multiple frontiers simultaneously. The Korean peninsula to the northeast, the Tibetan plateau to the west, the steppe frontier to the north. She read the military reports with the attention of someone who understood that wars are won or lost not only on battlefields, but in supply chains and in the political relationships that determine whether local populations assist or resist. She made recommendations. Some were followed. The outcomes were mixed, which is what the honest record shows and what the circumstances would have predicted. She was also raising 4 children during this period. Li Hong, the eldest son and crown prince, was receiving the intensive education that Tang protocol prescribed for an heir. Li Xian, the second son, was developing the intellectual sharpness that would define and eventually endanger him. The youngest two, Li Zian the younger and Princess Taiping, were still small enough that the daily texture of their lives was close rather than ceremonial. Taiping deserves attention even here, in these early years. Because of what she would become, she was her mother's daughter in the quality of her intelligence and her instinct for reading political situations. She grew up watching Wu navigate the most dangerous court in Chinese history. She absorbed, through proximity and daily observation, an understanding of how power actually worked that most people never develop, because they never have access to the education that proximity to real power provides. The relationship between Wu and her daughter would become one of the most complicated and consequential in the story. But in these years, it was still simply the relationship between a mother and a small girl growing up inside an extraordinary household, learning everything without yet knowing what the learning was for. The great aristocratic families of the Tang were watching the gradual erosion of their influence with increasing alarm. The network of relationships through which they had shaped access to the emperor managed the examination results that determined appointments and maintained their collective grip on the upper bureaucracy was being quietly and methodically worked around by an empress who understood exactly what she was doing and was doing it one appointment at a time. These families had resources. They had the historical memory of how dynasties worked. They had the Confucian moral framework that provided legitimate language for opposing what Wu represented. And they believed they had time, that Gaozong's health would eventually create the succession crisis that would allow them to reshape the court in their favour. They were making the same mistake that every major opponent of Wu Zetian made across 40 years of opposition. they were thinking about the situation as it currently existed. She was thinking about the situation as it would exist in a decade. Gaozong's health continued to decline through the mid-660s. The periods of incapacity became more frequent. The periods of full functioning became shorter. Whatever was affecting him was not improving with time, and the court that watched him understood, with the specific knowledge that courts develop about the physical condition of the people at their centre, that what they were seeing was a long diminishment rather than a temporary difficulty. Wu managed the transition with the same quality she brought to everything. When Gaozong was present, she supported rather than supplanted. When he was absent, she governed with the thoroughness the empire required. The line between the two was never sharp enough to become a formal point of dispute, which was itself a form of skill that the people around her rarely gave her credit for. She was 40 years old. She had been empress for a decade. She had been co-governing the Tang for the better part of 5 years. The empire was functioning. The military challenges were being managed. The administrative machinery was doing what it was designed to do. The next decade would test everything she had built in ways that the first decade had not. Because the question of who came after Gaozong was beginning to press against the present from the future, and the answer to that question was one that Wu had been thinking about since before most of the people asking it had understood it was a question at all. Chapter 5. What the Sons Cost Her. Power at the scale of an empire does not ask for a single sacrifice and then leave you alone. It asks continuously. It asks for the thing you most want to protect at the moment when protecting it would cost you the thing you have spent your life building. It is not cruel in the way that enemies are cruel, with intent and visible malice. It is indifferent, which in some ways is worse, because indifference cannot be argued with or appealed to or softened by the right words at the right moment. Wu Zetian had 4 children. The sources document that she educated them carefully, thought about their futures seriously, and built across decades of difficult work a position that would provide them with the most secure foundation available in the world she was navigating. She did what parents do when they love their children and understand the world those children are being raised into. And then, un by un, 3 of her 4 sons became political problems that the empire she was governing could not accommodate without resolution. Li Hong, the crown prince, was the first. He was, by the accounts that survive from people who knew him, a young man of genuine quality, thoughtful, principled, attentive to the welfare of the people in his care in ways that went beyond the formal requirements of his position. He had developed, through his education and his own inclination, a set of views about governance that were his own rather than merely inherited. He expressed those views, including views that constituted quiet criticism of certain aspects of his mother's administration. He died in 675. He was 23 years old. The cause recorded in the sources is illness, specifically the disease that Tang sources describe in ways consistent with tuberculosis, which was present in the period and entirely capable of killing a young man of his age. Some sources written later, particularly those hostile to Wu, suggest that she poisoned him because his independence made him a political liability. These later sources represent one interpretation of an event that contemporaneous records document as illness. Historians examining the evidence have not reached consensus, and the honest account requires acknowledging that. The illness explanation is consistent with the medical record of the period. The accusation of poison is consistent with the political narrative that Wu's enemies found useful and continued to elaborate. Both exist in the sources. Neither can be proven or disproven at this distance. What is certain is that Li Hong died, and that his death was a loss. His younger brother, Li Xian, was named Crown Prince. Li Zian was brilliant in the way that creates friction rather than harmony. He was quick to identify problems with received positions, including positions his mother held. He gathered around him scholars whose historical and literary work contained, in its treatment of empresses and powerful women in Chinese history, criticisms that were not entirely abstract. He was becoming, in the specific language of Tang court politics, a rallying point for opposition that had not previously had a face. In 680, Wu moved against him. Li Zian was accused of stockpiling weapons in preparation for a coup. The weapons were found, or were reported to have been found, in a search of his residence. He was stripped of his title, demoted to commoner status, and sent into exile in the southwest. In 684, he was forced to commit suicide. Whether the accusation was accurate or manufactured is another question the sources cannot definitively resolve. The existence of weapons could reflect genuine preparation or a planted discovery. The political environment of the period, in which manufactured accusations were a documented feature of court life, makes certainty impossible in either direction. What is certain is that by 680, the crown prince position had passed to her third son, Li Zhe, a man of considerably less independent character than either of his brothers. The court found him manageable. Wu found him workable. The distinction between those two assessments would become important sooner than most people expected. Gaozong was 53 years old, increasingly ill, and watching all of this from within the constraints of a body that was refusing to cooperate with the demands placed on it. He died in 683. Wu had known him for 34 years. She had been his concubine, his empress, his co-ruler, his most trusted minister, the person whose steadiness had held the administrative centre of the Tang together through decades of his illness. Whatever the full texture of their relationship, and the sources are too shaped by political purposes to give us its complete reality. The loss was real in the way that the death of someone you have known for 34 years is always real, regardless of everything else. She was 58 years old. The man who had been the formal anchor of her position in the world was gone. Li Zhe became Emperor Zhongzong. He lasted 55 days. The specific event that ended his reign was an argument about an appointment. Zhongzong wanted to make his father-in-law, a man named Wei Xuanzhen, a senior chief minister. When officials resisted on procedural grounds, Zhongzong reportedly said that he did not see why he could not give the entire empire to Wei Xuanzhen if he chose to. It was the sentence of a man who had not understood what an emperor was, who had confused the empire with property that could be disposed of according to personal preference. Wu issued the edict, removing him from the throne. It moved through the court with the speed of something prepared in advance, because it was. Zhongzong was relocated away from the capital and demoted to the title of Prince of Luling. His wife's family lost the positions they had briefly held. Wu's fourth son, Li Dan, became Emperor Ruizong. He was 22 years old. He had developed, in the years since his birth, a quality that his brothers had not. He was genuinely uninterested in governing. He was scholarly and aesthetic and inclined toward contemplation and away from the grinding daily work of imperial administration. He occupied the throne in the way that a man occupies a position he has accepted, because refusing would have been more difficult than acquiescing. Formally present, substantively absent, Wu governed. She was now Empress Dowager rather than Empress. But the title change reflected nothing about the functional reality of who was making decisions. She held audiences. She processed documents. She made appointments and issued policy, and kept the machinery of the Tang running with the same thoroughness she had brought to it for 2 decades. But her position was structurally dependent on her son's continued presence on a throne that she was managing for him. And this arrangement had a fragility that the political realities of the late 680s kept pressing against. In the 9th month of 684, a man named Xu Jingye raised a military force in the Yangzhou region and declared rebellion. He was joined by disaffected officials and commanders who shared the conviction that Wu's authority was illegitimate and that the Tang house required defense. The rebellion produced a proclamation written by the poet Luo Binwang that laid out the case against Wu with literary skill and genuine moral force. It accused her of usurping authority that was not hers. It called on loyal Tang subjects to take up arms. When a copy of the proclamation reached Wu's court and was read to her, the room presumably prepared for the reaction that a regent would have to a document calling for her overthrow. She asked who had written it. When she was told it was Luo Binwang, she said that a talent like his should have been better employed, and that the failure to find and use such a man was the fault of her ministers. She then crushed the rebellion militarily. Xu Jingye's forces were defeated within 2 months. But her response to the document itself, the pivot from the political threat to the literary regret, was the kind of move that people in that court remembered long afterward. It demonstrated something that was both genuine and strategically significant. She could distinguish between opposition and incompetence. A man could direct everything he had against her, and she would still recognize the quality of what he had directed. The rebellion was over. The position it had challenged was stronger than before. But the question that had been forming since Gaozong's death was becoming impossible to avoid. Wu was not simply managing the Tang Dynasty until someone more appropriate could take over. She was deciding that she was the most appropriate person available, and the world she was governing was about to learn what that decision meant. Chapter 6. The Architecture of a New Heaven. There is a specific kind of work that happens in the years before a great change. The work that makes the change possible, that lays the foundation on which the visible moment rests. This work is rarely dramatic. It happens in administrative offices and in private conversations and in the slow reshaping of institutions that takes years to become visible and decades to become irreversible. Wu Zetian spent the years between 684 and 690 doing this work with a focus and a patience that the court around her could observe without fully understanding what it was building toward. The foundation had 3 parts. The first part was religious. Buddhism had been present in China for centuries by Wu's time, carried along the Silk Road from India through Central Asia, absorbed into Chinese culture with a depth and permanence that made it no longer a foreign tradition, but a genuinely Chinese one. The great monasteries of the Tang were institutions of real intellectual and social weight. Buddhist teaching had reached every level of Tang society, from the emperor's court to the villages of the agricultural plain. Wu had been a practicing Buddhist since her years at Ganye Temple, and her relationship with the tradition appears to have been genuine rather than primarily strategic. She had supported Buddhist institutions throughout her years as empress. She had patronized translation projects and monastery construction with a consistency that went beyond the political utility of being seen to patronize them. What Buddhism gave her, beyond the personal meaning it carried, was a conceptual framework that the Confucian tradition structurally could not provide. The Confucian framework said clearly that the proper order of the world placed men above women in the hierarchy of governance. It had centuries of precedent and accumulated argument reinforcing this position. There was no space within orthodox Confucianism for a woman to claim the title of emperor in her own name. The framework did not contain that possibility. Buddhism was different in ways that mattered. Within Buddhist tradition existed the concept of the Maitreya. The future Buddha prophesied to appear in the world at a time of need and establish a reign of justice. In certain Buddhist texts, particularly a sutra known as the Great Cloud Sutra, there were passages that, with interpretive work, could be connected to the idea of a female ruler embodying a sacred mandate. In 689, a group of Buddhist monks presented Wu with an interpretation of the Great Cloud Sutra, arguing that she was the earthly embodiment of the Maitreya, that her appearance at this moment in Chinese history was not an anomaly but a fulfillment. Later, scholars examining this interpretation have noted, fairly, that the monks who produced it were working in a court Wu controlled and were reaching a conclusion she found useful. The interpretive argument was, by the standards of serious Buddhist scholarship, a substantial stretch. These are honest observations, and they belong in the account. But the political significance of what the interpretation provided was real, regardless of its scholarly merits. It gave Wu a legitimating framework that did not depend on the Confucian order that excluded her, one that operated on entirely different foundations and could not be defeated simply by pointing to Confucian precedent. Within weeks of the interpretation being presented, the Great Cloud Sutra was being distributed across the empire. New temples were being established in every prefecture. Buddhist imagery became more prominent in the visual language of the court. The infrastructure of an alternative, legitimating framework was being built in plain sight. The second part of the foundation was administrative, and it had been under construction for years. The examination system through which men entered government service was, in the early Tang, an institution whose meritocratic promise was significantly constrained in practice by the structural advantages that aristocratic birth provided at every stage. The great families had been managing the system for decades in ways that ensured their sons continued to dominate the upper reaches of the bureaucracy. Wu had been working around these constraints since her years as empress, cultivating scholars and officials from outside the great families, creating pathways to advancement that ran through her evaluation of capability rather than through the family networks that normally controlled access. By the late 680s, the network of officials whose careers had advanced through these pathways was broad enough and deep enough to constitute a genuine governing constituency. These were not simply personal loyalists. They were officials who had structural reasons to support the system that had advanced them. which made their support more durable than personal loyalty alone would have been. Direnji had by this point come to the central court and taken up a position of significant influence. He was a man of genuine capability and genuine principle, and his career trajectory reflected the examination pathway that Wu had been shaping. He served her with the specific quality of loyalty that comes from believing in the work rather than simply in the patron. He also disagreed with her sometimes, clearly and directly, which she permitted and occasionally acted on. The fact that she permitted it tells you something important about how she actually governed. The third part of the foundation was military, and it arrived at great cost. In the 9th month of 688, a rebellion led by members of the Tang imperial family itself arrived. Li Chong, the Prince of Langye, and Li Chen, the Prince of Yu, raised forces with the explicit goal of ending the regent's dominance and restoring direct Tang rule. Several other Tang princes joined or signalled support. The rebellion failed quickly. Wu's military forces were larger and better organised than the rebels had anticipated. Li Chong died in the field. Li Zhen committed suicide rather than be captured. In the months that followed, the Tang imperial family was reduced through a combination of executions and forced suicides that left very few members of the founding house capable of serving as a credible rallying point for further opposition. This is the part of Wu's path to the throne that the honest account cannot soften without misrepresenting. The members of the Tang imperial family who were killed were real people. The political logic that made their continued existence a threat to her position was real, and her response to that logic was consequential in ways that extended far beyond the political. The House of Li had built the Tang Dynasty. She dismantled much of what remained of it in order to clear the ground for what she was about to build. The foundation was complete. In the 9th month of 690, Wu Zetian formally proclaimed a new dynasty. She named it the Zhou, drawing on the ancient Zhou dynasty of Chinese antiquity, invoking connotations of virtue and cosmic order and civilizational legitimacy that she was claiming for her new enterprise. She took for herself the title of Shengshen Huangdi, not Empress. Empress. Emperor. The court assembled. The officials bowed. The woman who had been assigned the rank of Karen at 14, who had been sent to a monastery to disappear, who had been told in every available language and framework that the world she was standing in was not built for someone like her, sat on the dragon throne of China. She was 65 years old. What she did next would be the subject of this story's remaining chapters, and the subject of 14 centuries of argument about what her life meant and what it cost and what it was worth. The argument is still running. Chapter 7. Song, Succession, and the Price of Power. The Zhou dynasty that Wu Zetian proclaimed in 690 was an empire in every concrete sense of the word. It had a military, an administration, a tax system, a legal code, a capital city, and a population that historians have estimated at many tens of millions of people spread across territories stretching from the Korean peninsula in the east to the edges of Central Asia in the west. It also had a problem that no administrative system, and no religious legitimation, and no military force could solve directly. What came after her? The succession question had a shape specific to Wu's unprecedented situation. In the normal logic of Chinese dynastic succession, an emperor was followed by a son who carried the family name and the dynastic line forward. Wu had sons, but her sons carried the surname Li, the family name of the Tang imperial house. Not Wu. A succession to one of her sons meant, in the logic of dynastic naming and continuity, a restoration of the Tang rather than a continuation of the Zhou. The dynasty she had founded would, in the conventional understanding, end with her. The alternative was to name a nephew, a male member of the Wu family, Azirer. This would preserve the Zhou dynastic name in the conventional sense, but it raised a different kind of problem, one that Di Renji articulated to Wu with the directness that characterized his relationship with her. He pointed out that no emperor in Chinese history had made a nephew his primary heir in preference to a son. The ritual obligations were different. The ancestral relationships were different. He argued that a son would perform the ceremonies for Wu's spirit after her death that Chinese ancestral tradition required, and that a nephew would not, at least not with the same ritual standing. He was making an argument about the long accounting of Chinese civilization, about what Wu would be remembered as and how her memory would be honoured. It was an argument that operated in a register she had been taking seriously since her years at Ganye Temple, thinking about what persisted beyond a single life. The Wu nephews were pressing their case. Wu Chengzi was the most prominent of them, a man intelligent enough to understand the position he was potentially in and not quite wise enough to pursue it with the patience the situation required. He had supporters who argued openly for his designation as heir, forcing the question into the open before Wu was ready to resolve it. The advocacy was clumsy in ways that generated opposition even from officials who had no strong view on the substantive question, because the pressure tactics felt like coercion rather than argument. Princess Taiping was watching all of this. She was in her late 20s or early 30s in the early years of the Zhou dynasty, and she was watching with the specific attention of someone who had grown up close enough to the exercise of real power to understand what it actually required. Her network of relationships had been growing steadily. Her reading of the court's dynamics was accurate in ways that most of the officials around her could not match. She was her mother's daughter in intelligence and political instinct, and she was becoming, gradually and carefully, something more than her mother's daughter. She had her own views about the succession. She had her own relationships with the officials who would matter in any transition, and she was, with the patience she had learned from watching Wu, keeping those views and those relationships in the background rather than the foreground until the moment they were needed. Wu held the succession question open. She allowed the debate to run without resolving it. The officials who supported the Li sons and the officials who supported the Wu nephews both had to maintain their positions in a court whose ruler had not indicated which way the resolution would go. And maintaining a position under those circumstances required continuous political work that kept both factions engaged and neither faction confident enough to stop working. Di Renji's advocacy for the Li sons was persistent and took the form that the most effective advocacy takes in courts where the ruler is genuinely weighing a difficult question. He returned to the argument repeatedly, in different framings and different contexts, adjusting the angle of approach without abandoning the substance. He was not simply lobbying. He was making a case he believed in, and was willing to keep making at personal risk because the stakes were high enough to justify the risk. In the summer of 698, Wu had a dream. The sources record this, though the significance they attach to it varies by account. In the dream, a large bird had both its wings broken. She mentioned the dream to Direnji, and interpreted it immediately. He said that the bird was she herself, and that her wings were her 2 sons, and that without them she could not fly. It was the kind of interpretation that a trusted adviser delivers when he believes the moment has come to push an argument to its conclusion rather than continue to circle it. Wu recalled Li Jie from exile. He arrived in Chang'an after 14 years away. A man in his early 40s who had survived removal and exile, and the knowledge that his continued existence had depended entirely on the goodwill of the woman who had removed him. He arrived with the patience of a man who had learned patience through direct experience of what impatience cost. He was received at court with the ceremony that Wu had arranged, visible and public and unmistakable in its message to everyone watching. She named him Crown Prince. The Wu nephews understood what this meant. Wu Chengxi's faction did not disappear overnight, but its momentum was broken. The succession had been resolved in the direction that Direnji had argued for, and the resolution was clear enough that pressing for an alternative had become more dangerous than accepting the outcome. Wu was 73 years old when she named Li Jie her heir. The decision had cost 8 years of managed uncertainty and the continuous political work that uncertainty requires. It had also confirmed something that Direnji had been trying to tell her since the early years of the Zhou: the logic of the Chinese dynastic tradition, the logic of sons and ancestral obligations, and the long accounting of civilizational memory, was more durable than the alternative she had been considering. She had bent that logic in ways that had never been bent before. She had not broken it. There was one more thing happening in this period that the official record of the succession debate tends to obscure, but that the full story requires acknowledging. The Zhang brothers had begun to appear at court. Zhang Changzong and Zhang Yizi were introduced to Wu through Princess Taiping. They were performers and musicians of considerable skill. They were young, probably in their late teens or early 20s when they first came to her attention. They were, by the consistent account of sources from multiple political perspectives, unusually attractive. Wu welcomed them into her inner circle. The full story of what their presence meant is the story of the next chapter. But even here, in the context of the succession debate, their arrival is worth noting because of what it signals about where Wu was at 73. She had spent her entire adult life organized almost entirely around the demands of governance and power. The succession had been settled. The dynasty was functioning. The empire was intact. And in whatever space that settlement created, something else was forming, something quieter, something that had nothing to do with administration or legitimacy or the long game of political survival. Something human. The court noticed. The court always notices. What it noticed, and what it made of what it noticed, are 2 very different things. And the difference between them tells you something important, not only about Wu Zetian, but about the specific ways that history has chosen to remember her. That is the next chapter. Chapter 8. The Emperor at Work. There is a temptation, when telling the story of Wu Zetian, to move quickly through the years of her actual reign and spend the most time on the drama of how she got there and the drama of how she left. The coup, the accusations, the dead rivals, the blank stone at the end. These are the parts of her story that generate the most narrative heat, and they are real, and they matter, and we have examined them honestly. But the 15 years between 690 and 705, the years when Wu Zetian was not climbing toward power or being removed from it, but actually exercising it as emperor, are the years that determined what her life meant in concrete terms for the tens of millions of people who lived under her governance. Those years deserve the same careful attention we have given to everything else. So let us slow down here. Let us look at what she actually built. The cold stone of the examination halls in Chang'an and Luoyang in the early years of the Zhou dynasty felt different to the men who walked into them during Wu's reign than it had felt to the men who walked into them a generation earlier. Not physically different, the same floors, the same light from the same windows, the same smell of ink and paper, and the specific anxiety of men who understood that what happened in these rooms would determine the shape of their lives. What was different was who was in those rooms, and who believed, for the first time with some real evidence to support the belief, that what happened in those rooms might be determined by what they actually knew rather than by who their fathers were. The Tang examination system in the early years of the dynasty was a genuine institution with a real meritocratic logic. But that logic was significantly constrained in practice by the structural advantages that aristocratic birth provided at every stage of the process. The great families of the Tang court had been managing this system for decades with the skill of people who understood that an institution that formally selected on merit could be shaped to produce outcomes that were not substantially different from what straightforward aristocratic patronage would have produced. A young man from a provincial gentry family who passed the examination with genuine brilliance still needed connections to translate that success into a position of real influence. The connections were what the great families controlled. The examination was a gate they had learned to stand beside rather than remove. Wu worked on this problem from multiple directions simultaneously and over a period of decades rather than through a single reform. She expanded the palace examination and conducted it herself, with the seriousness of someone who understood that what she was doing in those examination halls was not ceremonial. She was looking for specific qualities: the capacity for honest analysis of real problems, the willingness to identify difficulties clearly rather than frame them in the softened language of officials who had learned that bad news is safer when it arrives wrapped in reassurance. The kind of practical judgment that governance actually required, as distinct from the kind of classical learning that examination preparation developed in isolation. When she found these qualities, she rewarded them visibly and specifically. The path to advancement ran through demonstrated capability as evaluated by the imperial center, not primarily through family connection and network management. She also expanded the categories of men who could realistically participate in the examinations by adjusting certain procedural requirements that had functioned as practical barriers for candidates from outside the established networks. The changes were incremental. They did not eliminate the advantages of wealth and education, which the honest account must acknowledge, because those advantages are deeply structural and cannot be removed by procedural adjustment alone. But the direction mattered, and the direction was sustained over 15 years of direct imperial reign and the decades of co-governance that preceded it. Later, historians examining the Tang and Song periods have noted connections between the examination reforms of Wu's era and the more fully realized meritocratic system of the subsequent Song dynasty. These connections are matters of ongoing scholarly discussion rather than settled consensus, and the honest account presents them as such. What can be stated with more confidence is that the direction Wu pushed the examination system was the direction that Chinese governance continued to move for centuries afterward, and that her sustained pressure on the system during a formative period contributed to establishing that direction. She also expanded the military examination, the Wuzhu, which tested martial and strategic capability rather than literary and administrative skill. She invested in it as a genuine pathway for military officers in a way that her predecessors had not, creating an additional channel through which capable men from outside the established military families could enter the command structure of the Zhou forces. The agricultural administration of her reign was grounded in the same practical intelligence. She issued what later sources describe as a systematic guide for local officials on agricultural management, drawing on existing knowledge and organizing it in a form designed for practical application rather than scholarly display. It addressed crop selection, the maintenance of local irrigation infrastructure, the operation of granary systems that could buffer against harvest failures, and the early warning mechanisms that allowed the central government to begin responding to regional shortfalls before they became crises. She reduced certain categories of the labour service obligations that Tang peasants owed the state. These obligations had been a consistent source of agricultural disruption because they removed men from their own fields during the growing season. The reduction was calibrated rather than complete, because the state genuinely needed the labour these obligations provided for the maintenance of roads and irrigation systems and defensive fortifications. But the calibration reflected attention to agricultural reality rather than simply to administrative convenience. She paid sustained attention to water management. This sounds simple, and it was not. The productivity of Chinese agriculture was fundamentally limited by the availability of water at the right time and place, and the state had both the capability and the responsibility to invest in the infrastructure that made that availability possible. Projects undertaken during this period contributed to agricultural productivity in the regions they served. The evidence for this is found in the tax and population records of subsequent decades rather than in proclamations, which is the kind of evidence that tells you something real rather than something intended. The famine of 696 was the most direct test of these preparations. The harvest failures that produced it were serious. They affected a substantial portion of the northern agricultural region. Under a less prepared administrative system, the records suggest this could have produced a catastrophe of the kind that Chinese history documents with painful regularity. Wu's response was swift. Granaries were opened immediately. Relief grain moved through the administrative network she had built over decades. Officials who failed to implement the relief measures effectively were disciplined. Officials who performed well were recognized. The famine killed fewer people than comparable events in other periods of Chinese history for which adequate documentation exists. That is not a small thing. That is the point of governance. The legal administration of her reign is the area where the honest account faces the most difficulty, because the difficulty is real and cannot be resolved by context alone. The Tang legal code that Wu inherited was, by the standards of 7th century governance, a sophisticated instrument. It was written, it applied across the empire, and it contained genuine procedural protections for the rights of subjects. Wu governed within this code for most of her reign. She also worked around its constraints when she found them inconvenient. The working around its constraints was real and consequential. The denunciation system of the 680s, and particularly the period when the investigator Lai Junchen led its most aggressive phase, produced genuine injustices. People were investigated and convicted on the basis of accusations that were false or exaggerated. Officials who had no connection to real opposition were destroyed because someone with a grievance had named them. The fear that characterized the court during this period is documented consistently across sources from multiple political perspectives. Wu was not unaware of this. In 691, she had Lai Junchen arrested and executed. She had concluded that the system she created was producing outcomes that exceeded its legitimate purpose, and she acted on that conclusion at political cost, because the evidence demanded it. This did not undo the harm that had been done. The honest account cannot present the correction as equivalent to the damage. What it can say is that Wu's willingness to recognize and correct a serious error in her own governance, without being forced to do so by external pressure, was itself a form of governance that the record documents, and that distinguishes her from rulers whose primary response to evidence of institutional abuse is the protection of the institution. The cultural life of the Zhou dynasty was not separate from the governance, but an extension of the same attention and the same values. Poetry and literature in Tang China were part of the administrative examination, part of the measure of a cultivated official's fitness for service. The cultural tone set at the imperial centre shaped cultural production across the empire. Wu held poetry competitions. She patronized painters and calligraphers and musicians with the engagement of someone who found genuine value in what they produced. She supported the translation of Buddhist texts from Sanskrit into Chinese, an enormous scholarly enterprise that required both linguistic talent and sustained institutional support to accomplish at the scale it reached during her reign. She wrote poetry herself. The poems attributed to her that scholars consider most likely authentic are marked by a quality of specific sensory attention and a willingness to sit with feeling rather than resolve it into reassuring conclusion. There is a poem associated with her that describes winter plum blossoms appearing in snow, their fragrance moving through the cold air toward the palace. The specific contrast between the warmth of the fragrance and the cold of the air around it. Whether every poem attributed to her is certainly hers is a question that textual scholarship has not definitively resolved. What is clear is that whoever wrote the best of them was paying the kind of attention to a specific moment in a specific landscape that comes from genuinely looking rather than reaching for a familiar image. She was Emperor of China. She was also someone sitting in a cold palace, smelling plum blossoms through a window and thinking about what that meant. Both of those things were true simultaneously. The officials who served her in this period left records that allow us to understand something of what working with her was actually like. She was demanding. She expected thoroughness, and she could identify when thoroughness was being performed rather than practiced. She engaged with the substance of problems rather than simply delegating them, which meant that ministers had to be prepared to defend their recommendations rather than simply present them. She had a memory for detail that officials found both impressive and unnerving, because she recalled the specifics of previous discussions and held current recommendations accountable to what had been said before. She was also, in ways that the official records only partially capture, a person who found the work of governance genuinely interesting rather than merely obligatory. The problems the empire presented were real and complex, and required real and complex solutions. And she engaged with them with the energy of someone who had spent 40 years learning to think about exactly these kinds of problems. Di Renji died in 700. He was the official whose judgment she had trusted most completely across the longest period of their association. He had disagreed with her directly and repeatedly, and she had permitted it, which, in a court where the emperor's displeasure was a career-ending event, was itself a statement about what she valued. His death removed from her immediate circle the person who had most reliably told her what she did not want to hear. She was 75 years old when he died. The lamp in the room felt different after that. She had been emperor for 10 years. She would be emperor for 5 more. The empire was intact. The governance was functioning. The succession had been settled. The examination system was producing the officials the empire required. By the measures available, it was a reign that had done what reigns are supposed to do. The question that the court was now managing, quietly and with the careful indirection of people who understood the cost of asking it too openly, was how much longer it could continue. The answer would arrive sooner than most of them expected, and it would arrive from within the palace walls. Chapter 9. The Opposition That Never Slept. Power at the scale Wu Zetian wielded it generated opposition the way weather generates pressure systems, continuously, from multiple directions simultaneously, through processes that could be managed but never fully stopped. She had been managing those processes since the day she returned from Ganye Temple. The military rebellions of the 680s, the aristocratic networks working through institutional channels, the literary criticism embedded in historical analogies, the procedural resistance of officials who served competently and within the strict letter of their obligations and not one step beyond. Each form of opposition required a different response, and Wu had developed, across decades of navigating this landscape, a range of responses that was broader than most rulers ever needed. The form she found most difficult to manage was not the most dramatic. It was the most persistent. The great aristocratic families of the Tang court had been losing ground steadily since Wu's elevation as empress, and they had absorbed this loss with the patience of people who understood that the loss of ground was not necessarily permanent. They had the resources for a long wait. They had the institutional memory of how dynasties worked and how they ended. They had the relationships that persisted across political transitions because they were grounded in the deep foundations of family connection rather than in the more volatile foundations of political favour. What they did not have, by the time Wu became emperor in 690, was a credible path back to the arrangement they had lost. The examination system had been reshaping the composition of the bureaucracy for years. The Tang imperial family had been decimated in the rebellion suppression of 688. The military had been restructured in ways that reduced the leverage of the old officer families. The court that Wu presided over was, in its essential composition, a different court than the one that had existed before her. This did not mean the opposition had disappeared. It meant it had transformed. It was present in the tone of official communications that were technically correct and practically unhelpful. It was present in the speed with which certain categories of policy were implemented and certain others were found to require further study. It was present in the historical scholarship being produced in the academies and monasteries of the empire. Scholarship that circulated in ways Wu could monitor but not control, that treated the question of women in authority with a consistency of negative example that was clearly not coincidental. Wu's response to this diffuse opposition was primarily administrative rather than punitive. She continued to appoint. She continued to evaluate. She continued to demonstrate. Through the sustained quality of the governance she was producing, that the alternative to the arrangement she had created was not a better arrangement, but a less capable one. The intelligence network she had maintained since the 680s was less active in the years of her direct reign than it had been during the Regency period. The most aggressive period of political investigation had passed. The court of the early Zhou was a court that operated with more procedural regularity than the court of the late Tang Regency had. Lai Yunshen's execution in 691 had been the signal that this shift was complete. The officials who had survived the aggressive period, and were still serving, knew that the rules of the court had returned to something closer to the normal rules of Tang governance, which were themselves not gentle, but which were at least predictable. The military challenges of the early Zhou period were real and in some cases serious. The Tibetan Empire remained a significant presence on the western frontier. It had been expanding for decades, and the relationship between Tang and then Zhou forces and Tibetan military power was one of recurring conflict and intermittent negotiation that no single campaign was going to resolve permanently. Wu's approach combined military response with diplomatic engagement and the tributary relationship management that Chinese imperial foreign policy had developed into a sophisticated instrument over centuries. The Khitan Confederation launched significant raids across the northeastern frontier in 696. The military response Wu initially authorized was entrusted to a general who proved unequal to the task, and the failure of that campaign required rebuilding the northeastern defensive position from a disadvantaged starting point. Wu replaced the unsuccessful commander with better ones. She adjusted the resources allocated to the frontier. She acknowledged, through the structure of her administrative response, that the initial approach had not worked. This capacity for acknowledging failure and adjusting accordingly was not a common feature of imperial governance, where the tendency to protect previous decisions was strong because acknowledging them as failures implicated the emperor who had made them. Wu appears to have been genuinely more interested in outcomes than in the protection of her own previous judgments. The Korean peninsula continued to be a theatre of strategic interest, managed through the combination of military presence, diplomatic relationship, and tributary engagement that organized Chinese imperial interactions with neighboring states. There was one form of opposition that Wu found genuinely difficult to address, not because it was militarily threatening or institutionally organized, but because it operated in the space where politics and personal feeling intersect, the space that is hardest to govern from a position of formal power. Her relationship with the imperial family she had reduced was not simply a political relationship. These were people connected to Gaozong, connected to the dynasty. She had built her own authority within, connected to her sons. The men she had killed or forced to suicide in 688 were the cousins and uncles of the crown prince. She was now preparing for succession. The question of how that history would be managed was one that the political record does not fully address because it was a question about feeling rather than administration. Li Zhe, the crown prince living in Chang'an after his return from 14 years of exile, was managing this complexity with the patience of a man who had learned patience through direct experience. He was attending to his duties as heir. He was visible in the court without being prominent in ways that would create friction with the empress, who had named him her successor after removing him from the throne in 55 days, 20 years earlier. The relationship between Wu and her son in the years after his return is documented in the sources primarily through formal court records, which tell you the shape of interactions but not their texture. Both of them appear to have understood that the arrangement was fragile and that its continuation required management from both sides. She needed him as the resolution to the succession question. He needed her continued goodwill to remain the resolution rather than becoming a problem again. It was a careful relationship between two careful people who had history that could not be undone and a future that depended on their capacity to work within it. Princess Taiping was also managing her own position with increasing sophistication. Her network of relationships had grown substantially in the years since the Zhou dynasty's founding. She was one of the most politically significant people in Chang'an outside of Wu herself. With access to officials at every level and a reading of the court's dynamics that was probably the most accurate of anyone not sitting on the throne. She was also, by the early 700s, thinking about what came after her mother in ways that went beyond simple succession planning. She had grown up in the shadow of one of the most capable rulers in Chinese history, and the question of what a daughter does with that inheritance, how you honour it, how you build on it, how you avoid being simply defined by it, was one she had been living with since childhood without ever being able to state it directly. The court that Wu presided over in the years between 700 and 704 was a court in the late stage of a long reign, with all the specific dynamics that late reign courts generate. The officials who had built their careers within Wu's system were thinking about how those careers would survive the transition that was coming. The factions organized around different visions of what the post-Wu court should look like were managing their positions carefully, maintaining the appearance of unified service while the internal alignments were shifting in ways that the formal record did not fully capture. Wu was aware of this. She had spent 40 years reading courts, and she knew what a court in this particular kind of motion looked like. She also knew, with the specific knowledge of someone who had been reading her own physical condition honestly for years, that the motion was accelerating because the transition it was pointing toward was approaching faster than most of the people around her were ready to acknowledge. She was 78 years old. The empire she had built was functioning. The succession was settled. The examination system was producing the officials the empire required. What was not settled was what would happen in the specific vulnerability of the transition itself. In the moment when the ruler who has organized everything begins to organize less. The Zhang brothers were already in the palace, and the men who were planning the transition were already planning it. The two facts were connected in ways that the next chapter would make clear. Chapter 10. The Last Companions. There is a particular kind of historical unfairness that attaches itself to powerful women with the persistence of a shadow that no light can fully move. When a powerful man takes younger companions in his old age, history tends to record it as evidence of his continued vitality, his capacity for enjoyment, the natural expression of a life that has earned its pleasures. When a powerful woman does the same thing, history tends to record it as evidence of her decline, her susceptibility to manipulation, the inevitable corruption of a ruler who should have known better. Wu Zetian has been subject to this unfairness since the day the Zhang brothers arrived at her court, and the honest account of her later years requires confronting it directly rather than navigating around it. Let us begin with what the sources actually establish. Zhang Changzong and Zhang Yizi were brothers who came to Wu's attention in the late 690s, introduced through Princess Taiping. They were performers and musicians of considerable skill. They were young, probably in their late teens or early 20s when they first appeared at court. They were, by the consistent account of sources from multiple political perspectives, unusually attractive. Wu welcomed them into her inner circle. She gave them access to her personal quarters that most officials did not have. She appears to have enjoyed their company with a warmth and regularity that the court noticed and recorded. She gave them official titles and positions that their administrative capabilities did not justify, which was a source of genuine concern to serious officials who worried that the brothers were using their access to the Empress for personal and political advantage. These are the established facts. Everything beyond them is interpretation, and the interpretations that the sources offer are heavily shaped by the political purposes of the people doing the interpreting. The hostile sources, written by or representing the perspective of officials and families who had opposed Wu throughout her reign, described the Zhang brothers in terms designed to be degrading. Their descriptions were explicit and carefully framed to support the argument that Wu's judgment had failed, that she was being controlled by young men whose primary qualification was their appearance, that the Empress, who had governed China with formidable capability for decades, was now a woman whose decisions were being shaped by people she could not see clearly. The sympathetic sources, fewer and more cautious, described the brothers as companions whose artistic talents and personal warmth provided Wu with a kind of human company in her old age that the formal demands of imperial life did not otherwise allow. Modern historians, examining the same body of evidence, have noted that the explicitly degrading descriptions in the hostile sources have the character of political invention rather than reliable documentation. That this specific kind of slander was a recognized weapon in Tang political culture deployed against powerful women as a matter of course, and that its presence in the sources is not itself evidence that the relationship it describes existed in the form described. What the same historians acknowledge is that the brothers had real access and real influence that went beyond what their official positions justified, and that Zhang Changzong, in particular, was documented in multiple sources as using his access to Wu to influence appointments and to protect individuals from consequences they deserved. This was a genuine governance problem that Wu's attachment to the brothers prevented her from addressing with the decisiveness she brought to most governance problems. Di Renji had raised concerns about the brothers with Wu before his death in 700. She had listened and had not acted with her usual decisiveness. This gap between her typical approach to problems and her reluctance to act on this one is the strongest evidence available that her attachment to them was genuine and deep. She was a person who acted decisively on evidence. On this subject, the evidence was not changing her behaviour. Something else was holding. The honest account requires saying both things clearly. The brothers created governance problems that Wu did not address adequately. And Wu, at the end of a life that had been organized almost entirely around the demands of governance and the exercise of power, had found in their company something that the rest of her world did not provide, and she was not willing to give it up. She was 80 years old. She had been governing for 50 years. She had earned the right to find comfort where she could find it. History has not agreed. History rarely does. For women in her position, Princess Taiping's role in introducing the Zhang brothers deserves examination in the context of what Taiping was doing in this period more broadly. She was one of the most significant political figures in Chang'an. Her network extended through every layer of the court. Her understanding of the dynamics around the throne was probably the most accurate of anyone outside the throne itself. She was thinking seriously about what came after Wu, and she was positioning herself carefully for that transition. Whether she introduced the Zhang brothers as a genuine act of care for her aging mother, or as a calculation about what a manageable distraction around an aging empress might mean for the court's future alignment, is a question the sources do not answer directly. These motivations are not necessarily exclusive. A person can do something that is simultaneously genuinely caring and politically convenient. What is clear is that Taiping was not simply her mother's daughter in these years. She was an independent political actor who had been building towards something of her own for a long time. The Crown Prince Li Jie was also navigating this environment, with the care of a man who understood that his position was more secure than it had been for 20 years, and still not fully secure until the transition was complete. He had his own network of supporters. He was watching the Zhang brothers with the attention of someone who understood that what happened in the Empress's inner circle had direct consequences for what happened at the moment of succession. Both Taiping and Li Jie, from their different positions and with their different objectives, understood the same thing about the Zhang brothers. The brothers' access to Wu was a source of instability in the transition process. As long as they were present and influential, the lines of authority in the court were less clear than a clean succession required. This shared understanding did not mean Taiping and Li Jie had identical interests or were working in a coordinated way. They were not. Their relationship was the complicated relationship of a sister and brother who had both grown up in the shadow of an extraordinary mother and who had different visions of what the post-Wu court should look like. But, on the specific question of the Zhang brothers, their assessments converged. In 704, Wu fell seriously ill. She was 79 years old, and the illness that struck her that year was severe enough that the court began openly managing the transition that everyone had been privately managing for years. Access to the Empress became restricted. The Zhang brothers maintained their close contact with her through the months of her illness, which the officials working on the transition found both politically obstructing and genuinely enraging. The coalition that formed to address this drew its membership from officials across different factional lines, united by the single shared priority of a clean succession to Li Jie. They would move in the first month of 705, and everything that Wu Zetian had built across 60 years of extraordinary work was about to enter its final reckoning. Chapter 11. The night everything changed. The 23rd day of the first month of 705 was cold in Luoyang. The sacred capital Wu, had designated as the primary seat of her Zhou dynasty, sat in the bend of the Yellow River, the flat agricultural plain extending outward in every direction. The winter fields empty and still, in the way that northern Chinese landscapes become in the months when the growing season is still far away. The wind came from the north without obstruction. Inside the palace complex, in the Yingxian palace where Wu lay ill, the cold pressed against the walls with the patience of things that simply wait. She had been ill since the previous year. The sources describe her condition in the language of the period: a weakening of vital energy, a failure of the fundamental forces that had sustained her across 8 decades of extraordinary living. She was 79 or 80 years old. The body that had carried her through everything was presenting its final account. The Zhang brothers were with her. The coalition that had been forming for months included Zhang Jianji, a senior official of long service and genuine concern about the transition. Guan Yanfan was among them, Jing Hui and Yuan Shuji. The core group had spent weeks identifying the key points in the palace's physical structure that needed to be secured and the sequence in which that securing would have to happen. They had cultivated the cooperation of Imperial Guard commanders, whose own assessment of where their futures lay had led them to the same conclusion the civilian officials had reached. The Crown Prince Li Jie was with them. This was the essential fact that transformed what they were doing from conspiracy into transition. A crown prince who arrived with the men removing obstacles to his succession was a crown prince demonstrating that the succession was happening rather than something that might happen. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a coup and a transfer of power. They gathered at Xuanwu Gate and moved through the palace toward the Yingxian Palace with the deliberateness of people who had planned their route and their timing. The Zhang brothers were found and killed. Zhang Changzong and Zhang Yizi died before the night was fully over. The action was completed with efficiency. Their heads were taken, as the practice of the period required for those executed for political crimes, to be displayed as confirmation that the night's work was done. Then the coalition reached Wu's chamber. Wu was awake. She was ill, her body diminished by months of serious illness. But she was conscious, and when she saw the men who had entered her chamber, she understood immediately what had happened. You do not spend 60 years in the most consequential court in the world without being able to read a room. She asked who had initiated this. Zhang Jianzi stepped forward and told her. He explained that the Zhang brothers had been removed for actions harmful to the state. He told her that the situation required her to transfer imperial authority to the crown prince. He framed what had happened as an action taken in the interest of the dynasty rather than against the empress herself, which was both politically necessary framing and, from the perspective of at least some of the officials who had participated, genuinely how they understood what they were doing. Wu looked at Lisa, her son, the man she had recalled from 14 years of exile, and named her heir after 8 years of deliberation. The man who was now standing in her bedchamber with the men who had just killed the people she had kept closest to her in her illness. She said, by the account that the sources preserve, that it was her son who had done this, not as a formal accusation, not as a cry of grief, as a statement, the recognition, compressed into a single sentence, of the full complexity of what the moment contained. Her son's presence meant that the dynasty would continue in the way she had arranged it to continue. Her son's presence in this room, in this way, on this night, meant that her reign was over. She was not harmed. The officials who had organized the action had no interest in harming her. Wu Zetian had governed one of the largest empires on earth for 15 years, and had been the functional ruler of the Tang for decades before that. The men standing in her bedchamber were not men who had forgotten what she was. They were men who needed what she represented in this specific moment. An orderly transition rather than a crisis. A legitimate transfer rather than a visible seizure. Harming her would have given them neither. Over the following days, the formal mechanisms of transition moved forward. Wu issued an edict describing the transfer as her own decision, moving imperial authority to Li Jie. The language of the edict reflected the requirements of legitimate transition rather than the full reality of the night it followed, which is the nature of such documents. They are written for history rather than for the moment. Li Jie became Emperor Zhongzong for the second time, beginning the second reign that would last until his death in 710. The Tang Dynasty was restored. The Zhou dynasty that Wu had founded and named and governed for 15 years was officially ended. Wu was moved from the Yingxian Palace to the Shangyang Palace, a separate compound within the palace complex. The move was presented as a comfortable retirement appropriate for an elderly woman in her condition. In practice, it was supervised seclusion, a way of maintaining the former empress in a setting comfortable enough to satisfy the requirements of filial obligation and separate enough from the centre of governance to satisfy the requirements of the new administration. Gaozong had been dead for more than 20 years. The sons she had raised and sometimes damaged were governing without her. The court that had been hers for decades was reorganizing itself around new centres of loyalty. The officials who had served her were recalibrating their positions in the new configuration of power. The world she had built was continuing without her. Zhongzong visited her at the Shangyang Palace. The sources record the visits without elaborating on what passed between the mother and the son who had stood in her bedchamber on the night that ended everything. The formal language of the records describes the visits as expressions of filial duty. What the conversations actually contained is gone. Princess Taiping also visited. Wu's daughter, who had introduced the Zhang brothers and participated in the coalition that removed them, came with the regularity that obligation required. The relationship between them in these final months is documented through the pattern of visits and through Taiping's subsequent political career, which suggests a woman who had absorbed her mother's understanding of power and was all ready, even while her mother still lived, thinking about how to apply it in the world that was forming around her. Wu lived in the Shangyang Palace for approximately 10 months. The sources that describe this period are spare. She was old and ill and removed from power, and the records that might have documented her daily reality in those months had neither the access nor the inclination to do so with depth. What we know is that she was there. What the record of those months also preserves, through the decisions she was forming in that quiet time, is that she was still thinking clearly, still deliberate, still here. She died in the 11th month of 705. The cause was the continuation of the illness that had been diminishing her since the previous year. She was 80 years old, or possibly 81, and the body that had carried her through one of the most extraordinary lives in the recorded history of Chinese civilization had completed its work. The news moved through the court and then through the empire with the speed that communication permitted. The response it generated reflected in its range and its complexity, the range and complexity of what her presence in the world had meant. Officials who had served her with genuine conviction received it with genuine grief. Officials who had served her out of calculation received it with the relief that the ending of uncertainty produces. Ordinary people across the empire, farmers and craftsmen and merchants and scholars, people who had lived their entire adult lives under a governance shaped by her decisions without ever knowing her name, received it in the way that most people receive the death of an emperor, as a distant event whose consequences would arrive in the daily details of life long after the announcement itself had faded. Her body lay in state with the ceremonies appropriate to a former empress. Zhongzong performed the mourning rituals a son owed his mother. The court observed the required period of grief. The administrative machinery of the restored Tang continued to function, which was in its own way, the most honest tribute available. A governance that continues without you is the sign of governance that was genuinely built rather than simply held together by your personal presence. She had built something that continued. Before she died, she made the decisions about her burial that the sources record with the specificity of things noticed and remembered because they were unusual. She reduced her own posthumous title from the elaborate form it had taken at the height of her Zhou dynasty to something simpler and more fundamental. She chose Zetian, meaning something close to she who follows the will of heaven. Not a list of virtues, not a catalogue of accomplishments, a description of a relationship between herself and the cosmic order, stated in the most direct available terms, and she instructed that the stone at her burial place should carry no inscription. The stone was erected at the Qianling Mausoleum in Shanxi province, where she was buried alongside Gaozong, in the tomb that had been prepared for both of them, and that had waited for her for 22 years since his death. The stone stands there still. It is blank. It has always been blank. That was the instruction. Chapter 12. The Long Argument. Stand at the Qianling Mausoleum on a clear day in Shanxi province and look north toward the burial mound. The site sits on a natural hill, the agricultural plain of the Wei River Valley extending outward in every direction toward the horizon. The landscape that has been the heart of Chinese civilization for longer than the writing exists to record it. The avenue leading to the mausoleum is lined with stone sculptures. Horses and lions and officials and figures representing the foreign dignitaries who came to pay tribute, rendered in Tang stone with the solidity of things made to outlast everything around them. The avenue is called the Shendao, the Spirit Way, and walking it, you are walking the path designed to carry the souls of the buried toward their rest. At the end of the avenue, before the burial mound itself, stand two stele. One carries the inscription that Zhongzong composed for his father Gaozong, thousands of characters recording the accomplishments and virtues of the second Tang emperor in the elaborate language of imperial eulogy. The kind of document that courts produce when a ruler dies, and the living need to manage how the dead will be remembered. The other is blank. 14 centuries of weather have done nothing to add to it. It says nothing. It has always said nothing. That was the instruction. The explanations that Chinese historians and commentators have offered for this decision across 14 centuries do not agree, which is itself part of the answer. Some have argued that Wu left the stone blank as an act of genuine humility, a recognition that her life was too large and too complicated, too full of things that could be read as both achievement and transgression, to be reduced to the character string that posthumous inscriptions typically contained. Better to say nothing than to say something that could not contain what needed to be said. Some have argued that it was a calculated political act, a way of leaving her judgment to posterity rather than to the officials of a restored Tang Dynasty who would have composed an inscription shaped by their own interest in diminishing her legacy. She trusted future generations more than she trusted the men who had stood in her bedchamber on that cold January night. Some have argued that it was a statement of confidence, the action of a woman who knew that her life was argument enough and that the stone did not need to speak because history would speak for it. Some have argued that it was a final refusal, the last act of a woman who had spent her entire life being defined by other people's frameworks, to be defined by one more. Some have argued that it was simply the decision of an 80-year-old woman who was tired and ill, and had done everything she had set out to do, and had nothing left to prove to anyone. All of these interpretations have merit. The fact that they cannot be resolved, that the blank stone keeps generating new readings 14 centuries after it was cut, is itself a kind of answer to the question of why she left it blank. She left it blank because she understood. With the quality of understanding that comes from spending 80 years paying close attention to the world and to herself within it, that a blank stone in the right place says more than any inscription can. She had spent her entire life being defined by other people's words. Taizong had given her a name. The court had described her in the terms that served the court's purposes. Her enemies had described her in the terms that served their purposes. Even her supporters had described her in ways shaped by what they needed her to be. The blank stone was hers. What does the blank stone actually say? It says, first, that the question of what she was remains genuinely open in ways that the questions about most historical figures do not. The Confucian framework that organized Chinese governance for centuries said she was an aberration, a violation of the proper order that the system eventually corrected. The Buddhist framework she had constructed said she was a fulfillment of cosmic prophecy. The administrative record says she was a capable governor whose system contributed to shaping Chinese governance for a very long time after her death. The personal record, the record of the sons and the rivals and the people she destroyed to build what she built, says she was a person who made choices that cost real people real things. All of these things are documented. None of them alone is sufficient. The blank stone refuses the sufficiency of any single one. It says, second, that legacy is not the same as monument. The inscription on Gaozong's stele tells you how the restored Tang Dynasty wanted to frame his reign. It is a document of political memory. The blank stone refuses to give the people who came after Wu a text they could use to manage how she was remembered. She had managed everything else in her life. She managed this too, through absence rather than through prescription. It says, third, something about the relationship between power and inscription that Wu appears to have understood deeply. Inscriptions are made by the powerful for the powerful. They record what the people who compose them want preserved. Wu had spent 60 years inside the machinery of imperial inscription, watching how the language of power was used to construct the versions of events that served the interests of the people constructing them. The blank stone is the refusal of that machinery. It says that her life will not be processed through the usual channels. It will have to be grappled with directly. 14 centuries of grappling is the evidence that the refusal worked. What does her life mean, in the specific terms of what it produced and what it cost? At the most concrete level, it means that the examination system she helped develop into its mature form contributed to shaping the foundation of Chinese governance for a very long time. The scholars and officials whose careers she made possible through her sustained investment in merit-based selection over aristocratic privilege were the beginning of a transformation in Chinese political culture whose full effects unfolded across centuries. Later historians have often noted connections between the examination reforms of the Tang period and the more fully realized meritocratic system of the subsequent Song dynasty, though the precise nature and degree of that connection remains a matter of scholarly discussion. What can be said with more confidence is that the direction Wu pushed the examination system was the direction that Chinese governance continued to move, and that her sustained pressure on the system during a formative period contributed to establishing that direction. This is not a secondary achievement. It is one of the most consequential governance contributions in the history of human civilization, and it belongs to a woman who arrived at the palace of Chang'an at 14 with no hereditary claim to anything, and spent the next 66 years building something that outlasted her by centuries. At the level of what it cost, it means the deaths of people who stood between her and the position she had determined she would reach. The members of the Tang imperial family killed in 688, the officials destroyed during the aggressive period of the intelligence apparatus, the rivals eliminated in the years of her rise. These costs were real, and the honest account cannot present them as simply necessary rather than also terrible, because they were both, and the people who paid them did not choose to pay them. At the level of the history of women and power, it means something that is both simple to state and genuinely difficult to absorb. She did it. She governed one of the largest empires on earth in her own name as emperor for 15 years. She demonstrated, through the sustained reality of her governance, that the claim women could not exercise imperial authority was not a description of a natural fact, but an assumption, and that assumptions could be violated and the world would continue. This did not immediately change the world for women in China. The Tang Dynasty restored after her reign was not a dynasty committed to expanding women's political roles. The Confucian framework that had been violated by her existence reasserted itself after her death, with the thoroughness that frameworks reassert when the specific person violating them is no longer there. Later, Chinese dynasties pointed at Wu Zetian more often as a warning than as a model. But the fact of what she had done could not be undone by the reassertion of the framework. She had sat on the dragon throne. The historical record said she had sat there. The blank stone stood on the hill and said nothing, and it could not be used to say she had not been there, because the stone's existence was itself the evidence. You do not erect a blank stele for someone who did not matter. Chapter 13. What she asks of us. Come back to the beginning for a moment. The year is 690. An old woman stands before the dragon throne of China and sits down on it. She is 65 years old, and she has survived everything the world could place between her and this moment. She is sitting in the seat that no woman in the long history of imperial China has sat in before as emperor in her own name, in the seat that the entire architecture of that history insisted she had no right to occupy. She sits down anyway. Outside the imperial palace city of Chang'an, the empire extends outward in every direction. Tens of millions of people going about the work of their days, farming and trading and raising children and governing cities, most of them unaware of the specific woman who has just sat on the throne that organizes the world they live in. Most of them never going to know her name in any detail. Her governance will shape their lives in ways they will never directly trace back to her. The officials who examine their disputes and manage their taxes and maintain the irrigation systems that water their fields are products of the system she is building and has been building for decades. The examinations through which those officials rose were shaped by her sustained insistence that capability matters more than birth. The granaries that will feed their families in the bad years are there because she understood that governance means preparing for the worst before the worst arrives. They will never know this. History will argue about it. The blank stone will stand on the hill and say nothing. she will have been there anyway. The question of what Wu Zetian asks of us, if we take her life seriously, rather than using it as a decorative historical example, is worth sitting with before this story fully ends. She asks, first, for honesty, not the honesty of confession, the performance of acknowledging that complicated things happened in order to move past them quickly and comfortably, the honesty of sustained engagement with the full complexity of what the evidence shows, the honesty of holding the administrative achievements and the human costs simultaneously without allowing either to cancel the other, because both are real and both matter, and the honest account requires holding both without collapse. She governed well by the measures available. She also destroyed people who stood in her way. Both of these things are true. The blank stone does not ask us to choose between them. It asks us to hold them together. She asks, second, for attention to the question of what makes governance legitimate. She spent her entire career constructing legitimacy through multiple overlapping frameworks because she understood that any single framework could be challenged and that legitimacy was not a possession but a continuous achievement. The Buddhist mandate, the historical precedents her scholars assembled, the demonstrated quality of the governance she produced, none of these alone was sufficient. Together they sustained a position that the world around her insisted was impossible. The question of what makes governance legitimate is not a question that any century has fully answered. The frameworks available now are different from the ones Wu was working with. But the underlying question, what gives any arrangement of power the right to persist and to make demands on the people it governs, is the same question that Wu was answering through the specific choices of her specific life, and the seriousness with which she engaged with it is worth examining not as a solved problem, but as one of the most consequential, serious attempts to work through it that history has preserved. She asks, third, for the recognition that the blank stone is not a mystery waiting to be solved, but an invitation waiting to be accepted. She had been defined her entire life by other people's frameworks. Taizong's court had given her a name and a rank and a function. The Confucian framework had given her a category that said what she was and was not permitted to become. Her enemies had given her the character of a monster. Her supporters had given her the character of a hero. Even the Buddhist framework she had constructed was, in a certain sense, a framework imposed from outside, a way of making her intelligible within a tradition rather than simply on her own terms. The blank stone refused all of these frameworks. It said, simply, that her life was large enough and complex enough and consequential enough that it would have to be understood on its own terms or not understood at all. That offer still stands. Stand before it and feel what it does to you. If it makes you want to know more about her, that is her intention working. If it makes you feel the inadequacy of easy judgments about lives this complicated, that is her intelligence working across 14 centuries. If it makes you sit with something unresolved, some question about power and gender and governance, and the specific cost of doing things the world insists cannot be done, that discomfort is the most honest response available. Wu Zetian lived from 624 to 705. She was a Karen of the 14th rank in one emperor's household, the empress of another, the regent of 2 more, and finally the emperor of China in her own name and by her own determination. She governed one of the largest empires on earth for the better part of 5 decades. She helped reshape the structure of Chinese governance in ways that contributed to how that civilization organized itself for centuries afterward. She demonstrated, through the irrefutable evidence of her own life, that the assumption women could not govern was wrong. She left a blank stone. It is still there. It is still asking the question. Every person who has stood before it in 14 centuries has completed it differently. The Tang officials who restored the dynasty and were relieved she was gone completed it one way. The Chinese women of later centuries who knew her name and understood what it meant to know her name completed it another way. The historians who have spent the 20th and 21st centuries arguing about what the evidence actually shows are completing it in a way she could not have anticipated. We are completing it now, in whatever hour and place this finds you, by the simple act of still being here and still wanting to know what her life meant. That sustained wanting to know is the most honest tribute available to someone who lived as she lived. Whatever your answer is, she is still listening, wherever you are right now, in whatever hour this finds you. Thank you for staying until the end. Until the next story, I wish you a quiet night